It took exactly 48 hours. 48 hours from capturing Venezuela's president to threatening another country's leader with military action. 48 hours from what Trump called a successful operation against narco-terrorism to openly discussing invading a second South American nation. 48 hours from the fall of Caracas to Air Force One cruising over the Atlantic while the President of the United States called Colombia's democratically elected leader a sick man who likes making cocaine and promised he wouldn't be in power much longer. The scene was surreal even by the standards of Trump's chaotic second term. Sunday afternoon, January 5, 2026, aboard Air Force One returning from Florida to Washington. The president had just spent the weekend at Mar-a-Lago conducting press conferences about the Venezuela operation, celebrating the capture of Nicolas Maduro and planning what he described as America's takeover of Venezuelan oil production. Now, flying back to the capital with reporters aboard, Trump was in an expansive mood, fielding questions about his South American military adventures with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had just accomplished something historic. The questions started simply enough. Reporters wanted to know about Venezuela's future, about who would run the country now that Maduro was in a New York jail cell, about whether American troops would remain on Venezuelan soil. Trump gave vague but aggressive answers about making Venezuela great again, about American companies soon selling Venezuelan oil, about his administration being in charge until a proper transition could occur. But then a reporter made what seemed like a routine observation. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro had been one of the most vocal critics of the Venezuela operation, calling it bombing with missiles and demanding an emergency United Nations meeting. Trump's response would transform a regional crisis into a potential continental war. "We have a very sick neighbor," Trump said, his voice carrying the dismissive tone he reserved for leaders he considered enemies or obstacles. "It's not a neighbor, but it's close to a neighbor, and that's Venezuela. It's very sick. Colombia is very sick too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States." He paused, letting the accusation sink in with the reporters scribbling notes or holding up recording devices. "And he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you." The reporters, veterans of covering Trump, who had learned to immediately follow up on provocative statements, pressed for clarification. "What does that mean? He's not going to be doing it very long." Trump's answer was even more direct, even more threatening. "He's not doing it very long. He has cocaine mills and cocaine factories. He's not going to be doing it very long." When another reporter asked if this meant Trump was considering military action against Colombia, the president didn't hesitate. "Sounds good to me." 3 words. Sounds good to me. A casual endorsement of military action against Colombia, a country of 52 million people, a democracy with regular elections, a longtime American ally in the drug war, a member of NATO's partnership programs, and most critically, a nation that had not attacked the United States or posed any imminent threat to American security. But because its president had criticized Trump's Venezuela operation, and because Trump had decided without evidence that Petro was personally involved in cocaine production, the president of the United States was now threatening invasion. The accusations against Gustavo Petro were as baseless as they were inflammatory. Petro, a former leftist guerrilla who had renounced violence decades earlier, had been elected president of Colombia in 2022 as the country's first left-wing leader. His administration had focused on peace negotiations with remaining armed groups, environmental protection, and reducing Colombia's historical dependence on coca cultivation through alternative development programs. He had been critical of purely military approaches to drug trafficking, arguing that the drug war had failed and that Colombia needed to address the economic conditions that drove farmers to grow coca. This nuanced approach to drug policy made Petro unpopular with American hardliners, who preferred aggressive eradication and interdiction. But there was zero evidence that Petro was personally involved in cocaine production or trafficking. The claim that the president of Colombia operated cocaine mills and factories was not just false, but absurd, the kind of accusation that in any previous administration would have been immediately walked back by State Department officials concerned about damaging relations with a key regional partner. But this wasn't any previous administration. This was Trump, who had just bombed Venezuela's capital and captured its president, who believed American military power gave him the right to reshape Latin America according to his preferences. The implications were staggering. If Trump could accuse Colombia's president of running cocaine factories without evidence and threaten military action based on that accusation, what was to stop him from making similar claims about any Latin American leader who opposed him? Mexico's president had been critical of the Venezuela operation. Would Mexico be next? Cuba's government had condemned the attack as state terrorism. Trump had already said on that same Air Force One flight that Cuba looked ready to fall. Was Havana next on the target list? The threat to Colombia was particularly dangerous because, unlike Venezuela, which had been isolated internationally and sanctioned for years, Colombia was deeply integrated into regional and global institutions. Colombia was part of the Pacific Alliance with Mexico, Chile, and Peru. It had strong trade relationships with the European Union. It was a major recipient of American foreign aid and military assistance. American companies had billions invested in Colombian oil, mining, and agriculture. The Colombian military had been trained by and worked closely with U.S. forces for decades. An American military operation against Colombia wouldn't just be an attack on one nation. It would shatter decades of hemispheric relationships and potentially drag multiple countries into a conflict that could destabilize the entire region. But Trump seemed oblivious to or unconcerned with these implications. From his perspective, the Venezuela operation had been a success. American forces had struck a foreign capital, captured a head of state, and faced relatively minimal international consequences. Yes, there had been condemnations from Latin American governments, from European allies, from China and Russia. Yes, Democratic senators were calling the operation illegal. Yes, there were questions about the 80 civilians and soldiers killed in the strikes. But Trump was still president, Maduro was in an American jail, and American troops were positioning themselves to control Venezuelan oil. In Trump's calculation, success bred success. If it worked in Venezuela, why not Colombia? Gustavo Petro's response to Trump's threats was measured but firm. Speaking from Bogotá hours after Trump's Air Force One comments, Petro rejected the accusations as lies designed to justify aggression. Colombia does not manufacture cocaine in presidential palaces or government factories, Petro said. We are fighting drug trafficking, not promoting it. These accusations from President Trump are not just false, they are dangerous pretexts for intervention. He called for an emergency meeting of regional organizations to address what he termed American imperialism and urged the international community to defend the principle that nations cannot simply invade their neighbors based on unsubstantiated claims. But Petro also struck a conciliatory note that revealed his understanding of the precarious position Colombia found itself in. Colombia is willing to work with the United States on drug trafficking, he said. We have been partners in this fight for decades, but partnership means mutual respect, not threats and invasions. It was the statement of a leader trying to de-escalate while maintaining national dignity, knowing his country lacked the military capacity to resist an American attack if Trump decided to follow through. The international reaction was swift and nearly universal in its condemnation. Brazil, Latin America's largest nation, issued a statement calling Trump's threats completely unacceptable interference. Chile described the comments as dangerous rhetoric that threatens regional peace. Mexico, despite its own complicated relationship with Trump, defended Colombia and called for respect for international law. Spain expressed deep concern about American threats against a democratic ally. Even some of America's closest allies found themselves in the awkward position of having to criticize Trump's Latin American policy. The European Union issued a carefully worded statement supporting Colombia's sovereignty. Canada expressed concern about the precedent of using military force against countries based on unproven allegations. But perhaps most significant was the reaction from within Latin America itself, where Trump's threats against Colombia after the Venezuela operation created a sense that the entire region was potentially at risk. If the United States could bomb Caracas and threaten Bogotá,
What was to stop Trump from deciding that Mexico City or Havana or any other capital in the hemisphere needed regime change? The Organization of American States found rare unity in calling for an emergency session to address what multiple member states were now openly calling American imperialism. The domestic American reaction was more divided, but increasingly concerned, even among Trump's usual defenders. Republican senators who had supported, or at least not opposed, the Venezuela operation found themselves uncomfortable with the president's casual threats against Colombia. Venezuela was a dictatorship. Colombia is a democracy and an ally. I need to see evidence, one Republican senator told reporters on condition of anonymity.
Senator Marco Rubio, Trump's Secretary of State and one of the architects of the Venezuela operation, found himself in damage control mode. In television interviews Sunday evening, Rubio tried to walk back Trump's comments without directly contradicting the president. What President Trump is expressing is concern about drug trafficking networks that operate in Colombia, Rubio explained. He's not saying the Colombian government is officially involved. When pressed on whether Trump had actually accused Petro personally of running cocaine factories, Rubio demurred. But Trump's own words were on the record, captured by multiple reporters. He hadn't spoken broadly about drug problems. He had specifically called Petro a sick man who likes making cocaine. He had specifically said Petro had cocaine mills and factories. He had specifically said Petro wouldn't be in power much longer. These weren't broad policy statements that could be reinterpreted. They were direct threats against a foreign leader based on specific, unsubstantiated allegations. Democratic senators seized on the contradiction between Rubio's cleanup efforts and Trump's actual statements. Chuck Schumer called the threats reckless and illegal. The president cannot threaten military action against a Democratic ally based on false accusations, Schumer said. This is exactly the kind of lawless behavior that led to the illegal Venezuela operation, and it needs to stop before we find ourselves in a regional war that nobody voted for. Representative Hakeem Jeffries went further, calling for congressional action to limit Trump's ability to conduct military operations in Latin America without authorization. The president has demonstrated he cannot be trusted to conduct foreign policy within constitutional and legal bounds, Jeffries said. Congress must act to prevent further illegal military adventures. But Republicans who controlled both chambers showed little appetite for constraining Trump, especially after what many conservatives viewed as the successful Venezuela operation. House Speaker Mike Johnson defended Trump's comments as tough talk designed to pressure Colombia into greater cooperation. The president is frustrated with the flow of drugs, and he's using strong language to get results. I don't think he's literally planning to invade Colombia. Yet Trump's own statements suggested Johnson's interpretation was overly optimistic. When asked later Monday if he was serious about military action against Colombia, Trump didn't back down. We'll see what happens. Petro is a bad guy, very bad for Colombia, very bad for the United States. He's allowing cocaine to flood our country, and that's not going to continue. We have options, and we're looking at all of them. The casual way Trump discussed potential military action against a country of 52 million people reflected a broader pattern in his approach to Latin America. From Trump's perspective, the hemisphere was America's backyard, and countries needed to follow American directives or face consequences. The Monroe Doctrine had been transformed in Trump's hands into a justification for American interference in Latin American countries whenever he deemed their governments insufficiently cooperative. This new Trump doctrine was being articulated in real time aboard Air Force One, where the president wasn't just threatening Colombia, but sketching out a vision of American dominance throughout the hemisphere. We're going to clean up this hemisphere, Trump told reporters. For too long, we've allowed bad actors to operate with impunity in Latin America. That's changing. Venezuela was just the beginning. The reference to Venezuela as just the beginning sent chills through diplomatic circles throughout the Americas. If Trump viewed Maduro's capture as the first step in a broader campaign, how many other governments were on his target list? Trump had already mentioned Cuba, saying the communist government looked ready to fall. He had threatened Mexico multiple times. He had made concerning comments about the Panama Canal. The pattern was clear. Trump believed American military power gave him the authority to reshape Latin America according to his preferences, without congressional authorization, without international law constraints, without regard for the sovereignty of nations that had been independent for 2 centuries. It was imperialism without apology, backed by the most powerful military in human history. Colombia found itself facing an impossible choice. If Petro continued to criticize Trump's Venezuela operation, he risked becoming the next target. But if he backed down, he would be seen domestically as weak. Petro tried to thread this needle by maintaining his criticism while simultaneously offering cooperation on drug trafficking, but it remained unclear whether this approach would satisfy Trump. The Colombian military, which had worked closely with American forces for decades, found itself in its own awkward position. Colombian defense officials had strong relationships with their Pentagon counterparts and received substantial American military aid. But those same officials were now being asked to prepare for the possibility that their longtime partner might become their enemy. Colombian military planning shifted from counter-narcotics operations to defensive preparations. The economic implications were equally severe. American companies operating in Colombia began conducting risk assessments about whether they should suspend operations. The Colombian peso fell sharply as investors worried about political instability. Tourism bookings dropped as travelers reconsidered trips to a country that might soon be a war zone. The economic damage from Trump's threats was immediate and substantial.
International law experts struggled to identify any legal justification for the actions Trump was threatening. Colombia had not attacked the United States. It had not harbored terrorists. The mere fact that drug trafficking occurred in Colombia did not give the United States the right under international law to threaten military action. Trump's accusations that Petro operated cocaine factories were not just unsubstantiated, but preposterous. But Trump had demonstrated in Venezuela that he didn't feel bound by international law. He had bombed Caracas, captured Maduro, and declared that America would run Venezuela, all without UN authorization, without congressional approval, without a declaration of war. From Trump's perspective, the Venezuela operation had been a success precisely because he had ignored all those constraints. By Monday evening, the crisis had settled into an uneasy stalemate. Trump had made his threats. Petro had rejected the accusations while offering cooperation. The international community had condemned Trump's comments. Democratic members of Congress had demanded action. But no one had actually done anything to constrain Trump or protect Colombia. The fundamental problem was that the American constitutional system had proven unable to constrain a president determined to use military force without authorization. Congress could hold hearings and issue statements, but without the political will to impeach, they couldn't actually stop Trump from ordering military action. The courts moved too slowly. International institutions could condemn, but had no enforcement mechanism. Colombia thus remained vulnerable to American military action, not because Trump's threats were legal or justified, but simply because he had the power to give the order. It was a sobering reminder that in international relations, power often mattered more than law, and that a president willing to ignore legal constraints could use American military might to threaten nations throughout the hemisphere with limited immediate consequences. As Air Force One touched down Monday evening, Trump descended looking satisfied. He had celebrated the Venezuela operation, threatened Colombia, mentioned Cuba, warned Mexico, and suggested American control of Greenland remained a priority. From his perspective, he was projecting strength and defending American interests. That his actions violated international law, lacked congressional authorization, and threatened to destabilize an entire region appeared not to concern him. Sometimes the most dangerous moments in international relations come not from carefully planned strategies, but from casual threats made aboard airplanes, from presidents who believe military power gives them unlimited authority, from accusations without evidence used to justify potential invasions. Trump's Air Force One threats against Colombia were all of these things, casual, unfounded, and catastrophically dangerous. Whether they would lead to actual military action remained uncertain, but the fact that a sitting American president could threaten a democratic ally with invasion based on made-up accusations and face minimal immediate consequences revealed how far American foreign policy had drifted from the norms and laws that were supposed to constrain the use of military force. Gustavo Petro, confronting threats from the world's most powerful military over accusations he knew were false, could only watch and wait, knowing that if Trump's words became actions, Colombia lacked the capacity to defend itself. It was the position Venezuela had found itself in just days earlier. The question was how many other Latin American nations would find themselves in similar circumstances before Trump's appetite for military intervention was satisfied or constrained. And the answer, increasingly, seemed to be that as long as Trump remained willing to threaten force, no nation in the hemisphere could be entirely certain it wouldn't be next.